Where do we go next?
Let's go Canadian Catholic.
Oh, boy. I don't know if she was going to say that. Canadian Catholic, welcome back to the show. How are you?
Hi, it's an honor to be back, both you, Jenna, and Matt.
Hi.
Very nice hosts.
Awesome.
So what have you got for today?
So here's what I would like to say. You know, both of you are ex-Christians who became atheists, and I was in the same boat, and I like to say I'm kind of one step ahead of you now. Because
Yes, I'm aware of that, and we had this is what got us off on the wrong foot last week, because I'm not convinced that we were in the same boat, nor am I convinced that you're a step ahead of us. But go right ahead.
Okay, so you know my story. I deconverted from being a committed Christian. It was more of a fundamentalist form. And I became a full-blown atheist, an inner circle atheist. I was into it. I was reading books. I still talk with David Silverman, you know, people like that.
Do you think that that's what makes you an atheist?
No, I lacked belief in God.
I don't.
Okay.
I don't know. I still don't know what an inner circle atheist is, and I will ask you to not mention David Silverman again for fear that I will say something about that piece of shit.
Excuse me. So inner circle atheist basically is a colloquial term that for someone who was, you know, in the inner circle who understood inner workings of atheism. It's just a colloquial I use.
Okay, what are the inner workings of atheism? Because my view, and you'll have to forgive me because I'm only the guy who's been doing this show for 15 years and has been, you know, running around on stage with, you know, Dawkins and Harris and everybody else. I'm not aware of any inner workings of atheism. Atheism is simply the position of not being convinced that a God exists.
Oh, sure. I agree with that. I just meant, you know, there are atheists who become atheists when they're disappointed with their church. And there are atheists who become atheists because of logical reasons and who make a conscious decision that there is little evidence for God. That's the camp I belong to. I consciously became an atheist.
Right.
Okay.
I agree that there are atheists who become atheists for bad reasons and atheists who become atheists for good reasons. But what that seems to suggest is that you've found good reasons to believe in a God now.
Yes, but I don't want to pursue that line where we just go into preponderance of evidence. I would just like to concentrate on one point on how my view has changed and maybe hear your view on what's your view.
Okay.
Is that fine? Okay. So when I was an atheist, one of the biggest hurdles to returning to religion was this issue of afterlife. Because I used to think, for example, that all the evidence seems to suggest that consciousness is purely physical. When child is small and its brain isn't developed as well, it is less conscious than someone whose brain is developed well. So that was one of the biggest.
Yeah.
How do you know that?
Not only is that not, so I would agree that the evidence shows that consciousness is a product of the physical and that everything we know and understand about consciousness seems to end with a person's death. But I don't know that I would say that a child is less conscious than an adult, less cognitively or less knowledgeable. I mean, they could have incredible cognitive capacity, but yeah, I think that argument that a child is less conscious, that's flawed.
There was different reasons, but basically you understand, I used to think just like you that consciousness is purely an emergent property of the physical workings of the brain.
I will correct something.
Please.
It's not that I'm asserting that consciousness is merely a physical product of the workings of the brain. It's that I don't see evidence that there's anything else contributing to it, and I don't know how one would demonstrate a supernatural component to anything.
Yeah. So, yes. So I probably went one step ahead of you back then, and I used to assert that all the evidence seems to suggest a purely physical origin for consciousness, because when we were to look how you can manipulate the brain, this used to be a huge hurdle for me in believing in afterlife or anything transcendental.
It should be, but so whether or not you went a step further to assert that the brain is in fact purely physical, that may have been an error, but I have no problem saying that based on the available evidence, there's no reason to conclude that anything beyond the physical is required for.
So I would like to now. I would like to now share my perspective on how it has changed. Okay, how my view has changed.
Sure.
I've become a devout Catholic now. I'm into Roman Catholicism. I'm all of it. I love the Bible. I love Catholicism, And, I never thought that I would be a member of religion ever again, let alone such a highly structured and organized religion like Roman Catholicism. And it was a surprise. But I'll tell you, I can't tell you the whole story. Let's just start with something small, how my view changed about consciousness.
Yep.
Okay, go for it.
So what I started realizing personally is if you were to look at the brain, it essentially is a highly complex machine, right? A natural machine, biological machine, but machine nonetheless. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So if I were to look at a cockroach's nervous system, a cockroach, for example, is, it has instincts that help it survive, evolutionary instincts that have developed that help it survive. But it does not really have anything that can be described as consciousness. Okay? So yeah.
You're saying that a cockroach isn't conscious?
Yeah, not in the way we are.
Well, okay, I would. So maybe we're having a problem with defining consciousness because quite often, and bear with me for a moment here because this might be slightly lengthy. Quite often what we refer to as consciousness is simply a notion of self-awareness and the possibility of self-reflection. Then there's the other thing, which is a little more difficult to define, which is sentience, which is a pronounced sense of self, I would suppose. So the fact that a cockroach, I would argue perhaps has conscious agency, even if it is merely running on instinct and intuition, in the sense that it's an agent and it will, it can move away from the heat sources and light sources and things like that. And so however rudimentary the programming is within the brain, to look at human beings and suggest that ours is so much more advanced that it's something special is something that I cannot do for the same reason.
That was not where I was leading.
I know. Well, I don't know that, but I mean, for the same reason, I can't rule out whether or not a computer created by humans could ever achieve sentience, consciousness, et cetera.
So to just continue what I was trying to say, the consciousness that I'm talking about is the ability to be self-aware, not simply have memory that helps you survive, but to be able to be aware as these processes happen. So my problem was here is where I started thinking, if you have a cockroach, right, and the cockroach has a system, it allows it to escape, it allows it to recognize where there is danger, to feel some sort of, sense of fear, maybe some primitive sense. And my issue was if you made that mechanism more complex, that cockroach brain, you would have a more complex way of achieving the same instinct-driven, goals. But
Sure.
At no point do you reach a point where this mechanism becomes aware of itself.
Okay, and see, here's where we disagree, because I don't know how you can have a self-preservation instinct without a sense of self. And it may be that the thing we're in disagreement about is what is often called a theory of mind, where human beings have not only a sense of self, but have the ability to think as if they were another agent. So like I can sit here and say, how would Jenna answer this call had I not been sitting here? I can think in those terms. And this is what human beings do in the sense of this sort of intentional stance, to put yourself in somebody's brain to figure out what their intentions are towards you. Now, that's certainly different than merely a sense of self, which you would be required. So there'd have to be some awareness of self in order to have self-preservation. And so if that's what you're talking about, that cockroaches don't have a theory of mind, I don't know how you can get to say, cockroaches have a program that has a self-preservation, but there's no way to increase the complexity of that to then achieve a theory of mind. I don't know how you can make that assertion.
Well, my point is that if you make something like a cockroach's brain or nervous system more complex, you'll achieve the same things in a more complex way.
Oh, no. See, that I don't necessarily agree with, because I don't know how you can say that our brain isn't just a more complex version of exactly what the cockroach does?
I mean, again, you could say that, but there is no physical point at which we can say after this complexity, the brain becomes aware of itself.
Okay.
So just because we don't know what that point is or if that point exists doesn't mean we can rule it out. And you are apparently ruling it out. You are saying no matter how complex, if you began with something like a cockroach's mind, you couldn't ever get to the sort of theory of mind that humans have. And I don't know how you determined that you can't do that just because we don't know. That would seem to be a sort of argument from ignorance.
There is no mechanism of action that shows such a thing as possible.
That you know of.
Yes, but why do we need to assume such things if we already do not understand?
We're not assuming. We just don't rule stuff out just because we're unaware of it. And that seems to be what you've done. You have said that you have reached the conclusion that there's no way to start with like a cockroach's brain, increase the complexity, and wind up with a human's brain. And I don't know how you can reach that conclusion while you simultaneously acknowledge that it is based on the fact that we don't know of a mechanism that would allow it. That is fundamentally the same as saying biological evolution cannot happen because we didn't know the mechanism for it.
Mm-hmm. No, I understand what you're trying to say, but it's also a different thing. I do think that you could increase the complexity of a cockroach's brain to reach the complexity of a human brain. But what I think, where I think the physical evidence points to is this, that if you increase the complexity of the cockroach's brain, you make the cockroach do the same things in a more complex way. It will be able to escape better, to feel danger.
So I tell you what you need to do then is go do that experiment to support your hypothesis, which is all you have.
Right. Yep.
So your perspective on the brain still remains a physicalist position?
I have no evidence to lead me to that there's anything more than the physical.
I understand, but let's put aside the physical supernatural distinction for a second. And here is where I'm aware there are many other callers, so I won't take too much time. I'll just make a point really quickly. Here is the way I look at it. The way I look at it is that the consciousness is related, the mind and the consciousness is related to the physical brain, but it's not the same. It's not.
Prove it.
Yeah.
Prove it.
Sorry?
Why do you see it that way?
So here's the thing. You started with an interesting hypothesis, and you've done nothing to demonstrate it other than to say we don't know of a mechanism that would allow this, and use that spurious reasoning to serve as a foundation that led you ultimately to Catholicism. And so what I'm saying is if you think that you have this hypothesis about minds and neural networks, then you should work to prove that and demonstrate it and not just run with it because you can't think of any way that it could happen. But that's a failure of imagination. That is definitionally an argument from personal incredulity.
I disagree. What I think is that when we look at it, right, when we observe the evidence, at least we have to be open-minded to the possibility of the consciousness being something that we currently cannot explain in terms of physical.
What evidence are you looking at?
Hang on. I'm absolutely open to that. I'm saying that I don't get to conclude that until you present the evidence for it.
He said when we look at the evidence.
You don't get to pretend as if I've closed off the possibility that there's something more than the physical when I've repeatedly said that I have no evidence that something more than the physical is needed or has been demonstrated.
I understand, but could it be...
I don't think you do understand. You keep saying you understand, but I'm not convinced that you do. Prove you understand.
No, I totally understand. I was in your shoes. Like I said, I was...
No, I don't think you were in his shoes.
I swear I'm getting ready to hang up on you again. Prove that you understand.
Yes, I know what goes through your mind right now, and I...
Whoa!
Goodbye,
wow.
Captain Jackass.
I can read your mind, Matt. I know exactly what you're thinking right now.